So, welcome to another episode of the Smuggling Hope podcast. This is designed to bring Catholic counsel to the community, and we address all types of concerns, whether it be mental health, our family structure, our marriages, our personal relationships. In today's episode, we're going to talk about the role of emotions and how to manage them, and how to better equip ourselves to be effective in dealing with really difficult or unpleasant and afflicting emotions, which all of us have. And oftentimes, we don't know what to do with those things. So if you are a fan of the podcast or you're joining us for the first time, please hit subscribe if you haven't already done so. If you find that this podcast has made a difference and deserves a 5-star review, please do that. That helps us to continue to expand the reach of this information and reach the people that it needs to reach. I'm in the psychotherapy field, but I'm in the only field that really creates the problems that it says it treats. And I really have a problem with that. I want to promote best practices and connect people with the things that will actually bring wellness and health to their family, to their individual life, and to their spiritual life. Because there is a great spirit of confusion in the world right now and discouragement, both in the Catholic Church, but throughout the world, and especially in the behavioral and medical sciences in the West. Again, so if you want to support the podcast, best way to do that, hit subscribe, give us a 5-star review. Before I jump into today's episode, which is going to cover emotional control and ways to manage our unpleasant or difficult emotions, I'm going to give a shout out to those that support the podcast. Primary support for this podcast is brought to you by Hearts Renewed. Go to heartsrenewed.org. That is an online marriage program that I comprised over 7 years of research and study to give people essentially what works step by step in marriage, right? And that is combined with the tenets of the Catholic faith to enhance your marriage, your communication, your parenting, and your spiritual life at home. So if you want to learn more about the program, go to go to heartsrenewed.org. And if you are listening to the podcast, all you got to do is type in Renew1 as a coupon code, right? So if you put in a Renew1, you will be able to try that whole program for your marriage for $1. Just for the first 7 days, you can try the whole program. You can look at everything, look at all the exercises, do whatever it is. I mean, I have people that just sign up and they want to look at the components of intimacy and sex. I have people that want to, they're going to focus on personal relationship communication, or they want to look at parenting and family culture dynamics. So again, go to heartsrenewed.org. And if you want to try the whole program for $1, for a week, just put in Renew1, and that coupon code is active. The other support of this podcast is, the Chesterton Academy of Buffalo. Chesterton Academy is a Catholic academy, Catholic high school that is in the classical form, right? So what is classical education? Really, it's to form the students in their spiritual life, their intellectual life, and their moral character. So, and again, it follows, if you want to look up classical education or what a Chesterton school is, you can go to buffalochesterton.org, and you can look that up, or you can look for a Chesterton school in your neighborhood or to form one. And just by going on Chesterton Academies and .edu, and you can look up how to either form your own school. And again, I'll put that always in the show notes. But my kids, two of my older kids, go to Chesterton Academy, which is again a Catholic high school, a classical high school in the Catholic tradition. And why I send them there realistically is I want them formed in their moral fiber, in their intellect, and I want them to have the understanding of their faith. And there's a war on education. I'm probably going to do a podcast on this. People don't know what education is for. If you're following our political debates in the United States right now, we're really confused about a lot of stuff, right? It's we call social extinction. We are killing ourselves off by preferences. We are not focused on what matters. It's we're very frivolous with we're fighting over what we value, right? So I don't want to go off on that tangent, but those are the two primary supports of this podcast. So check those out if you're interested, and thank you for listening. So now we're going to get into the program for today, which is again on emotional control. And so for a lot of people, I think that they come to me sometimes in counsel. For many years, I did anger management in terms of trying to help people with these different emotions that cause problems and concern. And so a lot of times people feel emotions and they categorize them as positive or negative, right? They're like, I hate this feeling, right? So if you look at a feelings wheel, or not even feelings, like one of those feelings charts in your doctor's office, or if you're a school counselor or a psychotherapist or whatnot, you'll see these charts. You can probably Google one today where there's going to be probably usually anywhere from 36 to 38 feelings that are described on this chart. And of the 36 or 38, only about 6 of them are positive or identified as a positive emotion, like happiness or joy or exuberant. The rest are seen as negative, right? Negative emotions. And the reason for that is really that the mind, our brain, evolved in many ways to survive. It did not evolve and survive through the experience of positive emotions. And so, like our brains are categorically organized more to a critical and negative nature for survival. Okay. So sometimes people are like, well, why are we so negative? Well, we have survived. Somebody who is, always thinking in la la land, so to speak. And again, this is a danger, is to think that people who are positive are naive. That is very wrong. That is very wrong. But the thing is about our brain is that our brains really have survived over time by recognizing and surviving through the negative experiences that human beings have gone through. And so I have to anticipate someone coming at me with a spear. I don't necessarily have to, I'm not going to survive just by reflecting on gratitude, right? So, but gratitude has its place and is incredibly powerful. But in a survival mechanism, remember, these things they set the groundwork for our brain's ability to function and for the body to survive over eons. So, most of us, though, struggle with negative emotions, right? So, people think a lot of the physical health problems in the United States right now, a lot of times they're correlated with, depression, right? Physical health and depression have a huge correlation, right? And so depression has a huge stranglehold on our medical establishment in terms of that experience is really bogging down and dragging down our medical, uh, you know, function, because we've got a lot of people that like heart disease, obesity, all these things are correlative with feeling depressed, right? And poor health, poor management of health, poor medication compliance. A lot of these things come down to experiences of depression. So, but what I want you to think about is, so we have negative emotions, or what we think of as negative emotions, and positive emotions, ones that we prefer. So sometimes they're like, oh, well, I don't want to feel sad. I want to feel happy. What I want you to think is we've really made emotions morally sensitive, right? Like I shouldn't be angry. I shouldn't be sad. I shouldn't feel guilt. I should only feel happy, right? You ask people all the time, like, well, how do you want to feel? And they'll be like, oh, I want to feel happy. That is like a very odd statement, because it's not the way human beings work. I want you to think that emotions, right, if we break that word down, emotion, right, this drive to action, drive to motion, right? There should be always a way for us to think that we feel things and then there is usually a constructive action associated with it, right? So the first thing I want to do with you today is to recognize that with an emotion, there is a constructive end. And we have to get rid of this idea that the emotion is bad. Feelings, the old Zen mentality was feelings need to be felt, but they need to kind of inform us, and they need to give us an understanding of how to behave or how to be constructive. If we judge them, prolong them, so for instance, if I'm sad and I hate being sad, I hate sadness. Well, now sadness becomes depression, and then now I hate being depressed, and now that depression becomes suicidality or despair. And so judgment magnifies and extends the distortion of negative emotion. And I mean, we don't judge positive emotion in the same way, if at all, right? When we're happy, we almost get anxious we're going to lose happiness, or we really don't think about it in the same terminology. Negative emotion feels like it goes on forever, right? It feels like agony. Positive emotion, we don't have that same problem. So negative emotion always distorts our experience of time. And so, again, we got to get rid of this moralizing of feelings that some are good or some are bad. You know, it's not that simple. Now, I'm going to take some information from the Japanese. The Japanese have a system. There was a psychiatrist years ago named Shoma Morita, and he is the founder, really, of what they call Moritist therapy, right? Which is, I guess after his namesake. And then obviously what has come across to our country in the United States is more of, in Hawaii and California, this experience of constructive living. And in some ways, it's a combination of different things. Now, in Japan, the mental health structure, at least the old mental health understanding, was that mental health was a moral experience, meaning that you did not experience your mental health or anything alone. It affects the whole, right? And in the United States, we do everything in isolation. We're very much about individuality, right? Which, again, there are good things to that. I want you to think, though, that with our experiences of mental health, oftentimes people feel isolated and abandoned and alone and cut off. And in Japan, the movement was really like a constant moving back into community and a responsibility to your family and to your workplace and to society, that you mattered and that you were valued. And I think that that is something we need to kind of take into effect. Also, then, if you think about emotions, is that emotions should not be cut off from the person either, that they need to be integrated. And so that is one of the key things about the conversation today, is we want to look at emotions is that they're information. Sometimes the information is correct, sometimes the information is incorrect, and I'll talk a little bit about why that might be. But the other dimension of it, and Jesus Christ in the Gospels and all of the saints and mystics tell you really not to trust feelings. So I'm not asking you to trust feelings, but I do want you to understand that they occur and we want to manage them and we want to move to places where we are integrating these emotional experiences. We're not letting them destroy us. We're not judging them and letting us become obsessed with the way we feel. So we become pathological in terms of we have a depressive episode or we have an anxious episode or we become suicidal or rageful or resentful, right? All these things can happen. And again, resentment is an extension oftentimes of emotional disruption for a reason I'll go to in a second. But we want to think about that emotions in many ways need to be seen as that they are something that is there that we feel and they have a constructive end in terms of that they need to move out from the person into a constructive activity. So for instance, if I am grieved, my father died years ago and I am grieved. He died. And so I can think about myself and go into myself again. And if I go into myself, I'm going to judge the experience or lose even sight of the experience or be terrified of the grief. And that could extend the whole emotional experience. Or I can understand that grief operates as a web of connection and to start recognizing grief in other people and sadness in other people, and then looking for ways to make a difference in the pain in others. That allows that emotional experience to move out. So I remain free. I remain free, but then I move into a constructive action. If I do not, move into a constructive action, that emotion gets locked in the body, and with it also comes some version of memory and some version of judgment of self. And so our feelings can start, if we start to judge them too much, they start to affect our identity, right? We start to say, well, I'm an angry person. I'm a depressed person. I'm an anxious person. No, you can feel anger, you can feel sad, you can feel unhappy, but you don't want to be sad, you don't want to be angry. That is now moving into a place of identity. And once you move into a place of identity, you start to feel less and less agency, less and less ability to make decisions when you have these experiences. Now, we're going to sidestep just for a second. As a tenet of this, so number one, we really want to get rid of the moralizing of good, bad, up, down emotions. They inform us and they have a constructive end. At least that's what I'm proposing to the audience. And that we have to figure out how to tolerate them so that we can start to move them away from us, but also through action, move into a constructive and meaningful engagement in our reality, both with our family or ourself or our society, so we don't get trapped in the experience. If we get trapped in the experience, we become much more unpleasant. And Now, the other thing about emotions that people need to understand, though, is they do not control them. You do not control how you feel. And you also, people don't make you feel things because your ability to control yourself, for the most part, is independent of all people. So to say, my wife made me feel this way, my kids made me feel this way. When we say these statements, I know this may be hard to hear, and I've said these things myself, is that as soon as I blame other people for an experience that I myself don't even control, what happens is that now I feel even more helpless. And because I've now pushed blame onto the other person for an experience, which is human, but it makes me feel more unstable. It makes me feel more afraid of the way I feel. And usually it escalates the emotion and makes it more pervasive, more limiting, right? So we want to just recognize that emotions are things, feelings are things that we do not control. I do not control how I feel. Sometimes I feel very relaxed and very calm. I mean, I was very ill, and prior to being ill, and what I've noticed over the course of my life, which has taken me way too long, is that before I get very ill, especially with a fever, my mood shifts radically where I can't tolerate things. I get very agitated with people, and it really has to do with physical upset in my system, in my body. So it's super important for people to recognize that, right? So keep that in mind, right? So we don't control how we feel. These things though do have a constructive end. There is always a movement, an action that we can take when we have a feeling, right? And again, like people will say, like, well, what about anxiety? Well, anxiety is a preparatory emotion. And my kids are in school now, so they've gone back to school now, so they've got to prepare for quizzes. A quiz is probably, or a test or exam or presentation is going to make you anxious. And so when you get anxious, what is it supposed to do? It's supposed to make you study. The action of studying reduces that experience of anxiety and then prepares you for the event, right? The presentation, the test, whatever. So emotions, emotions have a constructive end. So we want really to integrate these experiences so that we're not afraid of them and so that we move through each experience freely and with less and less fear of how we feel. And in many ways, allowing the feelings that we experience to inform us in terms of maybe what needs to happen or how we need to attend to ourselves or our relationships or our reality. And that will help us, right? And so, again, if you have a difficult experience, you're having an emotional or a feeling, you have to ask yourself, well, what is the constructive end of that? And that's very hard because these things like themselves, right? Feelings like themselves. They are, in many ways, for people, very addictive. And the more intense or upsetting they are, the more they hijack the brain. So if you think about the brain, right, just for a second, you have two floors really for our conversation, two floors of the brain. You have the upstairs. The upstairs is the higher cognitive part. So that's the part that has goals, is pretty rational. It's the one that is thinking about like how you're going to do your 401k, when you're going to retire, how you're going to organize your budget for next month, for your fiscal year, whatever it is. And then so that's the upstairs. The downstairs of the brain is all of these unconscious processes that are actively wired, right? So your breathing, your heart rate, but also in there, wired up into your automatic system is your emotional system because they obviously fire, right? So if you feel something, again, if I'm afraid, my body naturally needs to tighten up and send blood certain places so I can run away or defend myself. That is a good thing. The lower part of the brain is both automatic and it has emotion and it has memory. All three of those things are kind of stacked upon each other. And and so they don't realize that this part of the brain forms first, right? The part around your brain stem, like the lungs, the heart, the fight or flight system. Even when you're a baby in utero, that part of your brain grows first. So it is what we call like the lizard brain or, like the older brain. And so it has this ability to hijack the higher functions. So that's why, like in a lot of ways, like people can be very irrational. You can be a brilliant person, you can be a brilliant scientist, you can be, a very intelligent, very well-equipped person. But if your emotional system and your survival system are activated, unless you have done serious training, which very few people do, what happens is that whole part of the brain, the upstairs, gets overtaken. And because think about it like a ship, like one of those old school ships. There's a captain and a crew, like on on like some kind of like old pirate ship or something, right? There's a captain upstairs and there's a crew, and there's way more of the crew than there is of the captain, right? So the crew takes over and it's a mutiny. And you will say things that you regret or feel things and act out. You'll overeat, you'll get angry, you'll be impulsive because you're in the older form of the brain. And this upsets people, right? So we want to prevent, in our conversation today, we're really focusing on negative emotions. Negative emotions activate that survival mechanism of the brain. So it generates this hijacking, right? Our brains get hijacked by these negative emotions, or what we perceive to be negative emotions. But I want to say that they are survival emotions, right? I feel threatened. I feel my reputation is threatened. I feel my relationship with my family is threatened, my livelihood, my health. It could be anything, but and oftentimes it is this fear response. I always tell people that in every relationship, your marriage, your family, your boss, your friends at work, your friends at school, you know, every relationship in your life is really controlled by either love. So love hopes all things, endures all things, believes all things, like St. Paul says, or it's controlled through a mechanism of fear, which is passive aggression, straight up violence, a deception, lying, secrecy, control, manipulation, humiliations, whatever it is, but fear or love. And so when the fear system of the brain is active, you're going to see yourself or other people regress. Now, why is that? So the brain, like I try to explain this, like the emotional system of the brain and the memory system of the brain are kind of wired together because they have to be. Because every time you have a new experience, your brain is constantly adapting. And sometimes, like these events that we experience, we adapt in a way that no longer serves us, right? But when we feel something, we have a memory, right? And when we have a memory, we have an emotion, right? So emotion, there's going to be a memory. If you have a memory, there's going to be an emotion, right? And so we're going to talk about how to manage that a little bit, how that can be a part of stuff, and break that down. But I want to go back to this whole idea of having emotional control. So we do not want to have our higher functioning of the brain, our normal cognitive rational part, our everyday person, like, oh, you seem so rational. Now you're to keep that under control. We want to keep the body system under control. And so there's an acronym to use this in self-help, and maybe you've heard this in other places as well. The acronym is HALT. And HALT kind of outlines like 4 key things to survey, to address or recalibrate so that you do not escalate too far. So the 4 things in HALT stands for hungry, right? So hunger, anger is the A, loneliness is the L, and then the T is tiredness or sleep deprivation. So as a person, these are the 4 components. I mean, I'm not saying they're the only 4 components, but at least for our conversation right now, they can be very helpful. Is if I'm experiencing an emotional distress or upset, is my blood sugar stable? When was the last time that I ate? Maybe, I mean, I would say a lot of people's experiences of an emotional upset are connected to they have not eaten in a time. They have eaten for hours, or maybe even 18 hours, or 20 hours. They weren't hungry, but now they're angry, or now they're suicidal, or now they're anxious. Well, that could be blood sugar related. So again, are you consuming enough protein? Are you consuming enough water? If you're dehydrated, you're also going to be agitated. Okay. And this is a big deal, especially for people who are taking medication. You want to make sure that you're eating enough food, consuming enough calories, but you're also consuming enough water to metabolize the medicine appropriately. Otherwise, you're either getting not enough medicine in some cases or too much medicine. Both are not going to give you the correct dosage that you're thinking you're getting through your prescription, regardless of what medication you take. So it's hunger. The second one is anger. Anger is a protective emotion. There's a whole episode I've done on it's called Ending Anger Management. If you have not listened to that one and you are a person or you know a person who struggles with anger, listen to that. We go way more in depth with anger in that episode and what people can do and even some of the spiritual underpinnings of that. But anger is a protective or defensive emotion. It's also secondary, meaning that we have a primary emotion, right? I feel ashamed and then I get angry. I feel afraid, and then I get angry. I don't just become angry, right? And so, you know, with anger, anger is something that you really need to listen to and see as a bodyguard and figure out, like, do I need to leave someplace? Do I need to say something? Which is a huge component. Most of the people who have anger really have a hard time being honest and being truthful about how they feel. It's a lot easier to yell, to scream, to stomp. You see this with little children. Children don't have verbal ability when they're 2 or 3 very well, so they have tantrums. And then hopefully, if they have linguistic capabilities, their ability to de escalate themselves goes down, right? So, again, for us, we have to be able to have the language to talk about what we feel, specifically, what is the truth, and to relay the truth, to protect ourselves, to escape. Do I feel like I can escape? Do I feel like I can be protected? And so, again, that's the anger component. Loneliness. Loneliness, I mean, do you spend time with other people? Do you feel cut off from other people? Do you feel judged by other people? Or do you feel connected? And again, if you don't feel connected to other people, you're going to lose your humanity, right? That's what we saw with COVID. People lose their community, they lose their humanity, right? I mean, and again, I'm not going to get into all the intricacies of how COVID damaged people's mental health, especially all the propaganda and all of these bizarre things that they forced upon people. But it was very deliberate. And I would say there was way more science than people would ever want to know about what it's done, especially to the young people. So, but loneliness, can you connect with people? Are you isolated? Do you have any friends? Have you talked to anybody? Right. And then the last one, and this I think is a huge component for your mental health, but especially your emotional relay, is your ability to sleep. Right. So if you're tired, your mental health is already in the crapper. Okay. Remember, I would say at least half of people's mental health, sometimes I say even up to 75% of their mental health, sometimes is sleep related. And so, do you have sleep apnea? Um, that's undiagnosed. Do you drink too much caffeine and can't get to sleep? Do you have some kind of mania that you just have not addressed for whatever reason, a head injury or an illness that you had when you were a kid? If you're not sleeping, you're not going to think correctly. Your brain's not going to get information from the environment in your waking state correctly. And so you're going to always have some level of agitation or low levels of energy because if you don't sleep, your brain doesn't produce enough dopamine. Also, 80% of your new brain cells are produced while you're asleep. So you're also not going to learn as quick and you're going to feel stupid, right? I'm not saying that uh, it's a delightful thing, but these are things all have to do with sleep, right? So if we're working for emotional control and trying to get better with our emotional control and to deal with difficult emotions, we have to, am I eating correctly? Am I able to communicate how I feel? Do I feel free to protect myself or speak openly? Do I have people in my life or do I feel distanced from people? Have I isolated myself? And lastly, am I sleeping correctly? These 4 things can be huge to protect us from escalating emotionally and going into downward spirals. So those are some precursors, but this helps us, right? So now you are going to have emotional upsets in your life and afflicting emotions. And so one of the things that I want to share with you on this episode, and we go into full depth with this in the Hearts Renewed program when people want to do emotional control. So if you really are interested in this, check out the program for $1, like I said, and then just do the part on emotional control and regulation. There's a bunch of exercises you can do, and if you're really serious about that, I think you get more out of that than maybe like 12 weeks of anger management. Because again, we just want to give you what works. So emotional regulation again, emotion, painful emotion or any emotion is going to have a memory, right? So there's going to be a memory and an emotion. And so what you want to start seeing is that every painful or afflicting emotion is a memory, right? So I remember years ago I had a meeting at a facility I worked at, and the meeting had brought in this other individual that I rarely saw. That individual was just we'll just say that he was a very disruptive person. He was, I would say, like, pretty opinionated. And maybe he was just very much like me. And for whatever reason, though, I would have these very intense emotional upsets when this person was brought into meetings. And I remember on one occasion I had left and I had to leave the meeting because I was so infuriated with this person that I left to go to my car and I just screamed. I screamed in my car because I really couldn't be in the same room as this person. And then I thought about like, well, what? I mean, this has nothing to do with this person. He doesn't know me. He has no relevance in my actual life. He doesn't think about me. He doesn't care about me. None of this is personal, but I'm feeling this so personal. And so the question then became, well, when was it that I first felt the way I feel right now? Because I was so intolerant of that experience and I didn't want to experience it ever again. So I was like, son of a gun, I know this is terrible. And I'm just going to make the guy's name up. It's not his name, but we'll just call him Tim. Why is it that this is driving me nuts when I'm in a room with Tim? And I said, when was the first time in my life that I felt this bad? And I went back to being 5 years old. The first time I felt that bad, I was 5 years old, and I was trying to have my father teach me something. And my father, in a very abrupt, aggressive tone, said, well, you're stupid, and you'll always be stupid, and there's nobody that's going to ever be able to teach you anything. Now, I'm not saying this to paint my father as a bad man. He was just probably having a bad day. But I was 5 years old, and this became, for whatever reason, like again, as my brain has been built, people in authority, people that I should trust, my response to that event, right, as a little child, was that, well, when people communicated to me or talked to me in such a way as to make me believe that I was stupid, I would then become enraged and feel very helpless, right? So I know this may sound odd to you, but it was very powerful and very helpful. Just kind of like, think about it like an electrical problem, that this emotional wire was very hot. And the emotional wire that got fired up by this presence of Tim in this meeting was really connected to a memory I had when I was 5 years old. And 5 year old Danny is very different than grown adult Danny. And but in that moment, that man who is a professional, who's in a meeting, who's gone through all these life experiences, is acting like a 5 year old and wants to have a tantrum. And so, like my mentor said many years ago, you got to remember that adults are just children grown tall, and there are little children in us, little people in us, in the sense that that is a memory, and it got woken up with that painful emotion. Well, the first thing I want you to think about from this conversation is anytime you have a painful emotion, see it as a memory. And what this does is it moves us from the emotional track of the mind to a more cognitive and what we call narrative reflection of the brain. And what that does in the psychological sciences, we have a whole branch of therapy we call parts work. Some of you may have done that, or you've worked with people, or maybe you are a therapist who studied parts and you're like, oh, yeah, I do that. So, meaning that there are parts of the human person, these little people, and I don't want to make it too weird for you, but there is a reality to this. And for many people, they find this very powerful because they can have a relationship with these things that does not disturb them, and it gives them compassion for their life experiences that they are cut off from. Because I told you in the beginning, the goal of therapy or the goal of this emotional work, so to speak, is integration. The pieces of you, the pieces of me need to be connected. And they don't get integrated, they don't get connected with judgment, they don't get connected with fear. They only become connected by love. And so I can only love what I know, and I need to know about myself. I don't need to be afraid of myself. But when I'm acting like a 5 year old at a business meeting or a clinical meeting, it's not good, especially when I'm promoting to my clients how I should be under control. And so again, I have to this is not about my father. This is not about Tim. It's not about his personality. It has to do with me encountering these things and having to put love where there was judgment. I needed someone to be compassionate when I was 5 when I didn't understand things. I needed someone to say, you know, this isn't true. And again, for people who have been involved in therapy or counseling or people who do this work, you will recognize that these places are also the places where we begin to have self-limiting beliefs and the introduction of resentment, lies, a lot of blocks to our fullness of functioning, right? And that's why we shouldn't be afraid. When we have negative or painful emotions, we don't want to be afraid of them or upset by them or shut them down. We need to look at these are places of tension that limit our mobility and freedom to love people, to enjoy our life, to have more joy. Just so that I explain what joy is, and then I'm going to go back to the story. I'm not trying to jump around a lot. Joy is the choice to receive the present moment with love. And I can't do that very well if I'm blocked up with all of this tension and resentment and fear. I cannot choose to receive it because I'm always in a protective mode. I'm always in a protective stance. My hands are up. I'm ready to protect myself from the day, from the next person who's going to say something crazy about me or expose me to some dangerous thing or humiliate me. We don't want to move with perpetual tension because tension produces more and more fear, physically and psychologically. So the first thing is to see that every painful and afflicting emotion is a memory, to recognize that, to recognize yourself in that at the age where you first experienced that if you can. The second thing is really to see that, what is it that you as the loving adult need to do for that person or needed to do for that person? What did that 5-year-old need? And they needed to be told, well, Dan, no, you're not stupid. You're not stupid. Your father was having a rough day and you'll figure things out. And that may be all I need to know, but it helps me to chill out. But some voice of love has to be introduced. And that voice of love is not going to come from any place but for me. And I have to make those connections. But you have to realize that these negative and painful emotions, they put up what we would call like almost emotional wallpaper, right? People wear emotional wallpaper, right? So Tim was wearing the emotional wallpaper of my father. And again, this is not about my father. This has to do with the impression that that event had on my mind and affected the way that I encountered authority and encountered people that I believed to be authorities and instead had a high level of distrust and a high level of anger towards, right? And it's not just with Tim, it was with everybody, pretty much. Anybody that took that role or provoked that emotion, I would always have that response until I started to put something else in that place. And so, again, so start seeing also that any person who triggers your painful or afflicting emotion, see that every person that triggers your painful or afflicting emotion is also a memory, right? If you need to do that, that can be helpful. Stop thinking that this person is what you're struggling with because that person may not really take it personal at all. This may just be them going about their day or dealing with their own fears or dealing with their own little part of themselves that's afraid or feels judged. So you need to separate yourself from that, okay? And you need to see that those people may actually be, in their own right, experiencing some version of this too. So those things I think are very helpful. And so what you start to do though is you start to recognize yourself, like how old am I right now? Well, I'm 5 years old and I'm afraid. 5 years old and I'm afraid. Well, I need as the adult man for this 5-year-old, if I look at 5-year-old Dan who's sitting next to me and who is angry and wants to run out to the car, or wants to say something terrible, or wants to take the basketball home, doesn't want to play with anybody else, wants to act like a child. Well, you need to chill out. This is not about this. It'll be okay. And again, we need to tell ourselves it will be okay. We need to validate ourselves and find ways to love ourselves. And it sounds very weird and maybe it seems hippy dippy-ish to people, but it moves us out of this emotional track of mind. It helps us to have a narrative and a story whereby we're being compassionate and loving to ourselves. Because again, I need to reiterate this. Where there was judgment, there needs to be love if there's to be integration. And that way there's greater smoothness. And so the goal really isn't necessarily like that we're getting rid of emotions. It's that there's going to be less clankiness. There's going to be less roboticness, less like difficulty moving. We should be like again able to flow with our ability, or flow with our experiences of life. We do not want to constantly be like, getting jerked back and forth emotionally, falling to pieces, starting fights with people, getting angry, losing it, acting out, being immature. And again, you can tell because we end up becoming past orientated, right? We end up acting like little kids. We end up trying to bring up the past And again, if you're a person that has these experiences, again, where we are going back in these experiences to the past, that's when we're going to experience resentment. And resentment is its own bag of cats, right? So I'm going to, if you think about resentment, is it's to re-feel an event. And so that's why when you re-feel this event, you have to introduce compassion and love from the vantage point of the integrated person you are. You are not this experience. You are one viewing this experience. And so you have to be able to have some sobriety of mind. Again, you can't do that if you haven't followed some of this stabilization through that HALT process. Eating correctly, especially sleeping correctly, talking to people, getting this information from your environment so that when these events come up, you can get rid of these wrinkles that have happened in your life emotionally that upset you. So that when people do things, you can relax. You know who you are, right? You know who you are. You know what's going on. So hopefully this is a good starting point for many people. So share this with somebody who's looking for ways to gain emotional control, or wants to gain insight, or has been frustrated with the way they've been feeling, and go out and smuggle some hope wherever you can. And again, like right now, if you want to take a look and go a mile deep into this emotional control stuff, get that program for $1 for 7 days, and just do that one piece if you want. I think you'd be glad that you did. Okay? So go out and smuggle some hope, and I will see you back in a week.